Good evening, and thank you for being here. I have a friend who's in a U.S. Marine Corps Civil Affairs unit that deployed to Afghanistan in 2011. And during one part of their deployment, they traveled out to this very remote village in the mountains. It was the first time any Western unit had been to that town. And the villagers who came out to meet him said, "Zod svo tse. Zod sovet tse." It took them a while to realize that they were trying to say hi in Russian. The Marines thought this was hilarious. And my friend admitted that at first he found it quaint, perfectly fitting in with his stereotypes of Afghans in remote mountain villages, that the people here in 2011 would lack such basic understanding of what was happening in the world. The translator explained, "No, we're not Russian, we're Americans." The villagers absorbed this and then asked, "You're American? What are you doing here?" At which point he realized this was a hard question. He at first tried to explain 9/11, but that got confusing, and besides, it was a decade ago. The mission had changed so many times since then. It was hard to really answer their question, and he became embarrassed because he was a Marine representing his country. It was 2011, and here he didn't even have a basic ability to explain what was happening in the world. I tell that story because it's not often that the ground shifts beneath our feet. We see ourselves from the outside and are forced to put our notions about the world at risk in a real way. But that's something that happens continually in Nadeem Aslam's fiction, which repeatedly forces us to break out of the old way of thinking and look at the world anew, sometimes in wonder and sometimes in horror. This can happen at the level of ideology. A town in Pakistan in his 2013 novel Blind Man's Garden that refers to 9/11 as the Battle of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, since there are no innocent people in a guilty nation. It can happen in how Aslam portrays the dreams of his characters, one reminiscing about his childhood fantasies of martyrs, their souls just emerging from their bodies assisted by angels and other winged beings, the sun and the clouds red and the birds appearing blood-stained as they flew. It can happen, too, at the level of description. I was reminded of the brilliant World War I poetry of the British poet David Jones, the way that reality becomes fractured in this description of an exploding truck from his novel, The Wasted Vigil. For the next fraction of a second, it is as though the truck is in fact the picture of a truck, a photograph printed on flimsy paper, and the rays of the sun have been concentrated on it with a magnifying glass. And then the ground falls away from his feet, and a light as hard as the sun in a mirror fills his vision. The tar on a part of the road below him has caught fire. Soon they will feed you the entire world. The explosion has created static, and a spark leaps from his thumb towards a smoking fragment of metal flying past him. Then he's on the ground. Beside him has landed a child's wooden leg, in flames, the leather straps burning with a different intensity than the wood, and the bright, blood-seeping flesh of the severed thigh that is still attached. A woman in a burqa on fire crosses his vision. There's one subplot in Blind Man's Garden that felt so emblematic of these reversals that he excels at. There's a bit where there's a local peddler. His 14-year-old son is one of many Pakistanis who crossed the border after the invasion of Afghanistan, mistaking the Taliban's cause for the cause of the Afghan people, and end up being sort of brutally disabused of that notion once they cross the border. This child ends up captured, and he's now being ransomed by an Afghan warlord. One of the characters, a devout man, accompanies the peddler to a meeting with their contact to try and get this son back. And there he learns that many of the children are being sexually abused in captivity. He's just disgusted by the notion that anyone would ransom a child. And he rails against the man, only to have the tables turned on him. "Your boy was caught fighting against us. He probably killed some of our men. We need money to make sure that the widows and the children of those dead men don't become beggars." The real hell of life, as Jean Renoir once observed, is that everyone has their reasons. But it's not just the hell of life that Aslam captures so well. It's the delicate moments of connection, the more basic and universal desires of his characters, to teach in a school, to be with the person that loves them, to have a child, without war ideology bearing down and destroying them. These books are not defined purely by darkness. Levity and beauty pop up in even the most unexpected of places, in the tenderness and the private prayers of believers struggling with unbelief, in the pots of scented geraniums dragged at night to the center of the downstairs room in the hope that the breeze, dense with rose hips and ripening limes, would get to the sleepers upstairs ahead of the white intruders who had generated it by brushing past the foliage in the dark after breaking in. All great artists know that part of their task is to light up the distance between two human beings. Aslam writes in Maps for Lost Lovers, and that's what he succeeds in doing time and time again. Reading him, we see how ideology, culture, religion, politics, and circumstance provide characters both ways of understanding and finding meaning in their circumstance, but also they find the very shackles that prevent them from escaping. Describing jazz musicians, Aslam once wrote, "They seem to know how to blend together all that life contains, the real truth, the undeniable last word, the innermost core of all that is unbearably painful within a heart, and all that is joyful, all that is loved, and all that is worthy of love but remains unloved, lied to and lied about, the unimaginable depths of the soul where no other can withstand the longing and which few have the conviction to plumb, the sorrows and the indisputable rage." This is what we find in Aslam's work. It's why his work is so profoundly disorienting and so profoundly beautiful, and why I couldn't be happier to introduce Nadeem Aslam.
Good evening. It's a great honor for me to be here. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Lannan for bringing me here, and thank you, Phil, for this extraordinary, undeserved introduction. I will read to you from the manuscript of my new novel, a small fragment. I have never read it before. I've just delivered it, so it will be published next year. And then I will go on to read from the books that are already published. It was a large room. There were many shelves of books, a metal helmet for a stallion from the times of the Crusades, and there was the vertebra of a whale from a bay in Antarctica. In one alcove was the earliest known photograph of a snowflake. The child entered the silence and stillness of the vast interior through the far door. She came past the fishing canoe resting on a long, low table under the window. She was 7 years old, and her name was Helen. Two buildings stood next to each other at the center of the room. Each was taller than the girl, was perhaps 4 times her height. During that early morning hour, the light still only half awake, she stood looking at them. They appeared to be mosques, and they were beautiful, with their families of domes and semi-domes and minarets. She thought of them as 2 elaborate hats or headdresses, possibly meant for jinns, or a pair of giants from a fairy tale. She considered taking a few additional steps and peering through one of their windows. The colors and features were so precise and assorted, the muted shine on the walls and the arcs of the domes. She reached out and touched the detail of a painted leaf. "Building situated within a room!" Exclamation mark. Normally, it was a room that existed within a building, was contained by it. She described a circle around them now. She went past the cupboard where stood the vase of dried branches brought back from Russia. They were from the apple trees that Count Tolstoy had planted with his own hands. 4 of them were still alive in his orchard. The girl stopped when one of the buildings produced a creak, as though it were experiencing a mild earthquake. It stirred now and rose a few inches, breaking free of gravity, swaying a little. And then it ascended further, beginning to travel at a languid pace towards the ceiling. It was being pulled up by the delicate-seeming yet strong chains that were attached to the tips of its minarets. Eventually, it came to a stop, up there in the high distance. The immense room she was in was a library and a study, a place of fertile solitude. Due to its size, it was difficult to heat in the winter months. Not long ago, they had the idea of bringing in 2 small cabins, each just large enough to house a desk and chair, a stack of immediately necessary books, and papers, and a small heater. The thinking was that from December to February, a person would go into one of the cabins, close the door behind her, and work in that pocket of warmth. From ordinary cabins, however, they had become detailed models of 2 historic buildings, the great mosques of Cordoba and the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. The girl had caught glimpses of them being constructed during the previous few weeks. Now they were ready, and because it was June, they were being winched up to remain suspended up there until December. After the Hagia Sophia, she watched the great mosque of Cordoba being pulled up by the system of pulleys and chains. Neither of the 2 buildings had a floor of its own. They would borrow the Rung's floor when they were down here. So when Helen looked up now, she could see into the interiors. She imagined moths fluttering like trapped prayers under the miniature domes in the evenings, bumping against the colored insides. She would always remember this handful of moments from her early years, childhood, when minutes could feel as prolonged as hours and the days vanished in the blink of an eye. It was Helen's father who had carpentered the buildings, and it was he who was causing them to rise through the air, storing them out of the way. She turned and looked at him where he stood at the other end of the room, operating the various cranks and pulleys located near the corner. She liked the fact that he made one last minor adjustment to the chains, making sure both buildings were at exactly the same height. He was a tall, bright-blooded man, and his name was Lily. Thank you. Thank you. So that is the opening sequence of my novel, the next novel, which will be published next year, as I said. And people ask writers, how do you write? Where do your novels come from? And I always wonder whether Cézanne painted apples or whether Cézanne painted sin. I think the reader and the person who's looking at the work of art does half the work and brings their own interpretation. So this book, which I read from, is set in Pakistan, and it is about Pakistan's blasphemy laws, and it's about the treatment of the Christian minority in that Muslim-dominated country. Beyond that, I hope I will read from the novel that Phil spoke about, the novel that is set in Afghanistan, and the reason. And after that, I will read from the most recent novel, which is set in Pakistan, again, which Phil mentioned. And both of those novels were written out of a deep desire inside me to do something about the mean-minded and unknowledgeable, unknowing comments that were coming out of half the planet in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. People reacted as though it was an ahistorical event, as though that event did not have its roots in the policies of the Western governments, in the hidden parts of the planet. People talk about the Cold War, But the Cold War was really cold for the privileged places of the planet, for the West. It got pretty hot over there in the third world, in Afghanistan, etc. So, and I when in 1979 the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan, and it was decided in the Western countries with the help of Saudi Arabia, America, and Western Europe that billions of dollars worth of weapons and financial support will be channeled into Afghanistan via Pakistan so that we could give the Russians their Vietnam. And there were people back then who were saying in the 1980s, don't do this. This is a bad idea. What do you think is going to happen to these shiny, beautiful weapons once the Russians leave? And the Russians did leave, 1989, and the Civil War immediately began. And I, at the time, was working on a novel, on a previous novel, Maps for Lost Lovers, and I was also learning my craft. So I wouldn't move on to the next novel for an entire decade, more than a decade. But during that decades, and that's the 90s, I kept a notebook in which I had the idea that what would happen is that I will have the American involvement in Afghanistan, but once the war had ended, they will leave. But the mess had already begun. I mean, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died in that civil war which began. But you know, we were happy because we were here in a safe place, and we had given them their Vietnam, as it were. And it really didn't matter what those people sitting there in the rocks and dust were up to, because that is what they always did. They killed each other. And I knew that the American characters had to go back to in the novel that I would write once I'd finished the novel, once I'd finished Maps for Lost Lovers. And I was jotting down ideas of how these people would go back, how the Americans would return to Afghanistan to come face to face with what they had left behind. I remember making a note about during the late 90s, a Russian satellite fell to Earth, and it landed in the Canadian steppes, and it had enough nuclear material in it, fuel in it, that it couldn't be left lying around. So the CIA sent dog teams to go and retrieve that material in all that ice and snow. And I thought maybe once the CIA chaps get there, someone from Afghanistan, because Al-Qaeda was already a presence, I thought some terrorists from Afghanistan would also be trying to get their hands on, and then they would think, we'd better go and have a look at what's happening there. So, but then, of course, 2001, September the 11th happened, and I didn't need to invent a reason, and that happened. So the idea that, you know, why did it happen? So that was why I wanted to write these two novels. I think of Cicero, who said that, you know, to remain ignorant of what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child, and that was the impulse behind it. And whatever I say and whatever I do in my writing, and I know that I'm here as a Muslim, although nominally a Muslim, I'm not a believer. I mean, I'm in the States, and these two parts of the world are at loggerheads at the moment. But I have that most important investment, the investment of love in the West and over there in the Islamic world as well. Shemusini said that 2 buckets are easier carried than one. I grew up in between. So I sometimes feel that way. So whatever I write, it is always from a feeling of love and a feeling of disappointment towards both these sides. I know that the soldiers who are operating the drones who were killing Pakistanis in the tribal region of Pakistan. I know that they sometimes refer to the children that they see on their screen. They are here, the soldiers are here, and they are operating their things, but they can see into Pakistan. And the children that they see, they refer to them as fun-sized terrorists. So, and you can Google this term, the entire report will come up. So I know that, and I also know that in 2008, when the Director General of CIA raised the matter of collateral damage with Pakistan's president, that we were aware that the missiles were being thrown into Pakistan. And yes, we were killing terrorists, but we were also killing whoever happened to be in the building, children, women, men, whatever, visitors. And the president of Pakistan said, collateral damage bothers you Americans, it doesn't bother me. And that's in Bob Woodward's book, Obama Wars. So they said, I have grief and disappointment and love on both sides. So now I will read from The Wasted Vigil, the book that was, and again, this is the opening sequence, and again, it's a small fragment. And after that, I will read for longer from The Blind Man's Garden. Her mind is a haunted house. The woman named Lara looks up at an imagined noise. Folding away the letter she has been rereading, she moves towards the window with its high view of the garden. Out there, the dawn sky is filling up with light, though a few of last night's stars are still visible. She turns after a while and crosses over to the circular mirror leaning against the far wall. Bringing it to the center of the room, she places it face up on the floor, gently, soundlessly, a kindness towards her host who is asleep in an adjoining room. In the mirror, she ignores her own image, examining the reflection of the ceiling instead, lit by the pale early light. The mirror is large. If it was water, she could dive and disappear into it without touching the sides. On the wide ceiling above her are hundreds of books, each held in place by an iron nail hammered through it. A spike driven through the pages of history, a spike through the pages of love, a spike through the sacred. Kneeling on the dusty floor at the mirror's edge, she tries to read the titles. The words are reversed, but that is easier than looking up for entire minutes would be. There is no sound except her own slow breathing, and from outside, the breeze trailing its rippling robes through the overgrown garden. She slides the mirror along the floor, as though visiting another section of a library. The books are all up there, the large ones as well as those that are no thicker than the walls of the human heart. Occasionally, one of them falls by itself in an interior because its hold has weakened, or it may be brought down when desired with the judicious tapping of a bamboo pole. A native of the faraway St. Petersburg, what a long journey she has made to be here, this land that Alexander the Great had passed through on his unicorn, an area of fabled orchards and thick mulberry forests, of pomegranates that appear in the border decorations of Persian manuscripts written 1,000 years ago. Her host's name is Marcus Caldwell, an Englishman who has spent most of his life here in Afghanistan, having married an Afghan woman. He's 70 years old, and his white beard and deliberate movements recall a prophet in wreckage. She hasn't been here for many days, so there is hesitancy in her still regarding Marcus's missing left hand. The skin cup he could make with the palms of his hands is broken in half. She had asked late one evening, delicately, but he seemed unwilling to be drawn on the subject. In any case, no explanations are needed in this country. It would be no surprise if the trees and vines of Afghanistan suspended their growth one day, fearful that if their roots were to lengthen, they might come into contact with a landmine buried nearby. She lifts her hand to her face and inhales the scent of sandalwood deposited onto the fingers by the mirror's frame. The wood of a living sandalwood tree has no fragrance, Marcus said the other day, the perfume materializing only after the cutting down, like the soul vacating the body after death, she thinks. Thank you. So after that book, by that time, the war on terror had begun, and extraordinary things were being said by reasonable people who you thought were reasonable, by intelligent people who you had trusted all your lives. People would say things like, if there is if I know that there is a bomb about to go off in 30 minutes and I have a suspect, I wouldn't want to be the interrogator. And I remember asking myself, what is an artist doing identifying himself with an interrogator? Would he want to be the suspect? Surely that is where the artist's sympathy should lie. That is just as scary a situation, that I am innocent, but I can't convince you that I have nothing to do with this thing that is going to happen in 30 minutes. Along those lines, what Melville says in Moby Dick, that man ought to be a patriot to heaven, that we have to be always on the side of the angels. And even if some of the thinking that is in the air seems to be just perfectly reasonable and there is no alternative, I think we should have the courage to at least doubt it, to question it. As recently as the 19th century in England, it was believed that the poor was poor because God wanted them to be. The reviews of Jane Eyre in 1849, one of the reviews actually said that this book is full of murmurings against the situation of the poor, which surely is murmurings against God's appointment. It might look as though there is no alternative, but we as artists and human beings and need to question that. Those of you who have children in your lives will know that a child, when he or she is learning to draw, goes through a stage when, and it's an experiment you can do. You place an apple in front of the child and you say to them, draw what you see. And the child, to the best of his or her ability, will draw an apple. It will be a circle with a dent at the top, perhaps a stalk coming out of it. And you say to them, well done, darling, that's great. And then you take the apple, you take a pencil, and you drive a pencil through that apple so that a little bit is sticking out there and a little bit is sticking out here. And you place this arrangement before them and say, draw what you see. The child will draw the apple again. Then they will make a line going all the way through the apple. You say to them again, well done, darling, that's great. But I asked you to draw what you see. Is this what you see? And you can ask them 100 times. They would be adamant that that is what they see. They know that the missing bit of the pencil is inside the apple, so they see it. Because of course they can't see it. And then as they grow up, months go by, and then they learn to leave out the middle bit. Then they only do that bit and that bit. And sometimes I think that we should, as writers, thinkers, and human beings, try to make our way back to that earlier stage, where this room where we are standing, where I'm standing, where we are sitting, this room is full of invisible forces that we can't see, but they are here, and they're acting on me, they're acting on you, all of us. It's forces of good forces as well as bad ones. Capitalism, communism, jihad, love. I didn't get to be the size I am without anyone shouting at every street corner, watch out, a car is coming. I can't pretend I don't have neighbors. I cannot pretend I don't live in a society. I cannot pretend that I am alone. I didn't get to be the size as I am. As I said, I have needed other people around me. So that's the idea, and that is what I wanted to write. So that is why I wanted to write. That was the next installment of my 9/11 thing. And now I will read from the beginning, and and also the other thing, the other important thing in my books is the idea that we mustn't despair. That the idea that of those books nailed to the ceiling, that so occasionally throughout the story, throughout those 300 pages, the books keep falling to the floor. So there is a kind of rain of stories and poems, which then someone picks up, they pull out the nail, and then they open it, and there's a hole going all the way through, and then they read it, and there are stories about, it's someone's library which has been nailed to the ceiling, for reasons which will take too long to explain, but I'm looking at the time. You can't see, but there's a clock here. And so, yes, so the idea that these are some of the, whatever is happening at the moment, these are some of the earliest stories we human beings know. There isn't a child, there isn't a person in this room among whose very first few words that you heard were, don't lie, don't cheat, don't hit, be fair. And then the tragedy is that as we grow up, we begin to take some of the taint from the world. And that is not the message I wanted to give. That is not the sole message I wanted to give, because I think existence is such a beautiful phenomenon. I am not religious. I don't believe in a soul. I believe in a consciousness. So that the idea that my body has a consciousness is such a thrilling thing to me. And I want to, and I want that to be in my novels, and to show, and to offer a kind of consolation, to offer a kind of courage that we've been here before. I was looking at Alfred Kazin's journals the other day, and in 1966 he went to a sit-in for Vietnam. And everyone was there. Susan Sontag was there, Norman Mailer was there. And he says that halfway through, one of the security people leapt onto the stage and wanted everyone to sing God Bless America. And so, as I said, that kind of thing has always been happening. And, our defeat isn't new, neither is their victory. But we're not going to give up. That's the idea. So now I will read. So this is from The Blind Man's Garden, the opening sequence. History is the third parent. As Rohan makes his way through the garden, not long after nightfall, a memory comes to him from his son Gio's childhood, a memory that slows him and eventually brings him to a standstill. Ahead of him, candles are burning in various places at the house because there is no electricity. Wounds are set to emit light under certain condition. Touch them and the brightness will stay on the hands. And as the candles burn, Rohan thinks of each flame as an injury somewhere in his house. One evening, as he was being told a story by Rohan, a troubled expression had appeared on Gio's face. Rohan had stopped speaking and gone up to him and lifted him into his arms, feeling the tremors in the small body. From dusk onwards, the boy tried to reassure himself that he would continue to exist after falling asleep, that he would emerge again into light and love on the other side. But that evening, it was something else. After a few minutes, he revealed that his distress was caused by the appearance of the villain in the story he was being told. Rohan had given a small laugh to comfort him and asked, "But have you ever heard a story in which the evil person triumphs at the end?" The boy thought for a while before replying. No, he said, but before they lose, they harm the good people. That is what I'm afraid of. Rohan looks out of the window, his glance resting on the tree that was planted by his wife. It is now 20 years since she died, 4 days after giving birth to Gio. The scent of the tree's flowers can stop conversation. Rohan knows no purer source of melancholy. A small section of it moves in the cold wind, a handful of foliage on a small branch, something a soldier might snap off before battle and attach to his helmet as camouflage. He looks towards the clock. In a few hours, he and Gio will depart on a long journey, taking the overnight train to the city of Peshawar. It's October. The United States of America was attacked last month. A day of fire visited on its cities. As a consequence, Western armies have invaded Afghanistan. The Battle of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon is what some people here in Pakistan have named September's terrorist attacks. The logic is that there are no innocent people in a guilty nation. And similarly, these weeks later, it is the buildings, orchards, and hills of Afghanistan that are being torn apart by bombs and fire shells. The wounded and injured are being brought out to Peshawar, and Gio wishes to go to the border city and help tend to them. Father and son will be there early tomorrow morning after a 10-hour journey through the night. The glass pane in the window carries Rohan's reflection, the deep brown iris in each eye, the colorless beard given a faint brilliance by the candle, the face that is a record of time's weight on the soul. He walks out into the garden where the first few lines of moonlight are picking out leaves and boughs. He takes a lantern from an alcove. Standing under the silk cotton tree, he raises the lantern into the air, looking up into the great crown. The tallest tree in the garden are 10 times the height of a man, and even with his arm at full stretch, Rohan cannot extend the light beyond the nearest layer of foliage. He is unable to see any of the bird's snares, the network of thin steel wires hidden deep inside the canopies, knots that will come alive and tighten just enough to hold a wing or a neck in delicate, harmless captivity. Or so the stranger had claimed. The man had appeared at the house late in the morning today and asked to put up the snares. A large rectangular cage was attached to the back of his rusting bicycle. He explained that he rode through town with a cage full of birds and people paid him to release one or more of them, the act of compassion gaining the customer forgiveness for some of his sins. I am known as the bird pardoner, he said. The freed bird says a prayer on behalf of the one who has bought its freedom, and God never ignores the prayers of the weak. Rohan had remarked to himself that the cage was large enough to contain a man. To him, the stranger's idea had seemed anything but simple, its reasoning flawed. If a bird will say a prayer for the person who had bought its freedom, wouldn't it call down retribution on the one who trapped and imprisoned it? And on the one who facilitated the entrapment? He had wished to reflect on the subject and had asked the man to return at a later time. But when he woke from his afternoon nap, he discovered that the bird pardoner had taken their perfunctory exchange to be an agreement. While Rohan slept, he visited the house again and set up countless snares, claiming to Gio that he had Rohan's consent. He told me he'll be back early tomorrow morning to collect the birds, Gio said. Rohan looks up into the wide-armed trees as he moves from place to place within the garden, the thousands of sleeping leaves that surround the house. The wind lifts now and then, but otherwise there is silence and stillness, a perfect hush in the night air. He's certain that many of the snares have already been activated, and he cannot help but imagine the fright and suffering of the captured birds, who swerve and whistle delicately in the branches throughout the day, looking as though their outlines and markings are drawn with a finer nib than their surroundings, more sharply focused. Now he almost senses the eyes extinguishing two by two. The bigger the sin, the rarer and more expensive the bird that is needed to erase it. Is that how the bird pardoner conducts his business? A sparrow for a small deception, but a paradise flycatcher or a monal pheasant for allowing a doubt about God's existence to enter the mind. He places his hand on a tree trunk as if transmitting forbearance and spirit up into the creatures. He was the founder and headmaster of a school, and his affection for this tree lies in its links with scholarship. Writing tablets have been made from its wood since antiquity, a use reflected in its Latin name, Elstonia scholaris. Carrying his lantern, he begins to walk back to the house that stands at the very center of the garden. Before building it, he had visited the cities of Mecca, Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, Delhi, and Istanbul, the sixth location of Islam's earlier magnificence and possibility. From each, he brought back a handful of dust, and he scattered it in an arc into the air, watching as belief, virtue, truth, and judgment slipped from his hand and settled softly on the ground. That purifying line, in the shape of a crescent or a scythe, was where he had dug the foundations. In the 19th century, Rahan's great-grandfather had bred horses on this stretch of land. His animals known for their wiriness and nimble strength, the ability to go over the stoniest of grounds without shoes. During the mutiny against the British in July 1857, a band of men had visited the horse breeder the day of the eclipse, and in the 17 minutes of half-darkness, the mutineers spoke about cause and nation, aiming these words like arrows against the empire's armored might. Britain was the planet's supreme power at that time, and nothing less than the fate of the world hung in the balance. They needed his help, but he told them that there were no horses for him to give. The Norfolk trotter and the Arab stallions, the Dhani, Taliganj, and Kathiawar mares, they had all been sent to a remote location to escape the Ludhiana fever sweeping the district. As the rebel turned to leave, the ground splintered slowly before them, and a crack appeared and became a star-shaped fracture. A small sphere of blackest glass materialized at the center of the star. Then they realized that it was in fact an eye, an ancient glare directed up at them through the grains of earth, a phantom, a chimera. One more instant, and the entire head of the horse had emerged from the ground. The large muscled neck giving a thrust and spraying soil into the eclipse-darkened air. The hooves found whatever purchase they needed, and the rest of the grunting animal unearthed itself. The mighty rib cage and the great potent haunches, flesh tearing itself away from the living planet. The ground exploded. A dozen horses, then almost 2 dozen, their diverse screams filling the air after the hours spent in the darkness. An eruption of furious souls from below, the thrown earth and the shrieking of freed jaws and the terror of men during the daylight darkness. Rahan's great-grandfather had been informed the day before that the mutineers, being hunted by the British, would attempt to appropriate his animals. Over several hours, he and his 9 sons had prepared a trough deeper than their tallest stallion and had then led all 25 of the horses into it, their black, white, Tobiano, and rowan colors shining in the oblique rays of the setting sun. The horses were loved, and they trusted the masters when they were blindfolded and led into the pit. But they reacted when the men began to pour earth onto them, beating their hooves against the ground as the level of soil rose higher along the legs. Stripes of white salt froth slid down each body, and in low voices the men spoke the phrases or words each animal was known to like, to comfort them if possible. But they continued with the work steadily and with determination all night as the stars appeared and hung above them like a glass forest. And later, when a storm approached and the night became wild with electricity, the sky looking as though there was a war and rebellion in heaven too, because not a single one of the horses would be allowed to fall into the hands of the mutineers, who Rohan's great-grandfather was convinced were misguided, his loyalty aligned with the British. With only the horses' necks remaining visible, the men leapt down into the trench and packed the earth with their feet, running among the 25 heads growing out of the earth as specks of soft blue fire came down from the lightning-filled sky to rest in the manes and in the man's own beard and hair. God had said to the south wind, "Become," and the Arabian horse was created. The thought of clemency entering their hearts at last, the 10 men went down the rows and placed a large basket upside down over each head, a hood of woven grass fibers and reeds and palm fronds, a pocket of air for the animal to continue breathing. Then they climbed out and began the final throwing on of the soil, making sure not to cover the baskets entirely, leaving a thumbprint-sized entrance in each for air to slide in. There was nothing but a faint ground shudder of hooves from within the earth as the horizon became marked with a brilliant red line behind the men, and the sun rose, and they began to wait for the arrival of the mutineers, conscious suddenly of their weight on the ground. Insects are being attracted by the lantern in Rohan's hand as he walks back to the house. Moths that look like shavings from a pencil sharpener, and moths that are so outsized and intensely pigmented that they can be mistaken for butterflies. There is a black feather on the path ahead of him, dropped by a struggling bird overhead. The mutiny was eventually put down across the land, and 1,000 years of Islamic rule came to an end in India, Britain assuming complete possession. A Muslim land was lost to non-believers, and Rohan's ancestors had played a part in it. This was the century-old taint that Rohan had tried to remove by spreading the soil of God's 6 beloved cities here: Mecca, Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, Delhi, Istanbul, scattering them broadly in the shape of the trench in which the horses were interred, the cleft out of which they had resurrected themselves. Thank you.